The internet's a little slow, so if I disappear briefly, that's why. So, welcome to this live that is part 3 of the class planning series. So we started a few weeks back with part 1, which was the opening of the class, the warm-up, and then part 2, which was the sort of the bulk of the class, the peak of the class, we called it. And then this is part 3. So this is how do we get from the peak to the end of our class. So today's all about the cool down, Savasana, and the closing of the class. So if you've seen the first video of this series, part 1, you might remember me talking about the importance of kind of setting the stage even before the class begins. And I think the same applies to this part, but the very end of the class after it's finished. So those two are sort of bookends to the practice. So the class doesn't end just when the asanas stop, and it doesn't really even end once you've closed and thanked everybody for coming. There's a little bit after, and we'll talk about that when we get to that part. So up until this point, if you're planning a class, you will have planned out your opening, your warm-up, the bulk of your asana, your peak pose if you're using one, your theme, you'll have your theme, any other additional practices that you're using in there, pranayamas or meditations or mantras, you likely would have those already kind of laid out in your sequence, most likely. So let's dive in. So we're going to talk about the cool down, which I guess in many ways is very similar to a warm-up. It's kind of the reverse of a warm-up a little bit. But how you begin the cool down really depends on where you're coming from. So say, for example, we're creating a class that has a peak pose. And maybe that peak pose is a standing pose. So maybe it is dancer's pose or half moon or some sort of other standing balance. Now we need to find a logical way to begin the cool down from that standing position. For me, easiest thing to do is to flow down to hands and knees and come to child's pose, because likely after doing the peak pose, sort of a more difficult, challenging standing poses, balancing poses, we might want to take a few moments of rest. So coming down to child's pose is a nice way to do that. Another way to come down to sit would be to come to malasana, so guide your students into the squat shape. From there you could place the hands behind, come to sit, or maybe again from malasana you come to child's pose. But the key is to keep guiding your students throughout. Some things that I've seen over the years, for example, might be something where somebody says, so you do your dancer's pose, and then the teacher says, now come to child's pose. And they don't cue down, and they don't guide students in a collective way together to come to that child's pose resting shape. Now, is there anything wrong with doing it that way? I guess not necessarily. We're not doing anything badly, but transitioning and guiding and cueing transitions is really important in the way that it keeps your class with a certain vibe and flow and energy. And if we break that and we just say to students, find your way there on your own, we're sort of doing them. I think for me it would be a little bit of a disservice. So it's really important, no matter where you're going next after your peak pose and you begin your cool down, to keep guiding and cueing. So that's sort of an example of if you were in a standing position. Now if your peak pose was an arm balance or back bends, you are either going to be kind of on your hands and knees position, maybe downward dog, or maybe you're already on your back because you've done a whole series of bridge pose back bends or wheel or something like that. So then you need to think how you're going to bring your students to either a logical counter pose after that shape. So after back bends, we likely are going to want to find a couple of counter shapes for that, or how you're going to bring them into a shape that begins the cool down portion of your class. If you're already on your back, you might just keep them on their back because that's quite easy. Instead of coming up to sit for 2 shapes and then coming back down on the back to continue the cool down, try and think of sort of some logical ways that you can do those sort of seated shapes that you might want to do, but do them on your back. So for example, if my students, say we did wheel pose, just hypothetically because I can't do it, but say that we did do wheel pose, I would probably do knees to chest after that, just as sort of a little bit of a counter stretch. And then I might do something like thread the needle. Wind relieving pose would be some nice cool down shapes. I might do something like maybe a sequence of thread the needle, wind relieving pose with the same leg, one knee twist, coming back again, maybe holding the back of that leg, doing some leg stretches, and then the same on the other side. And then I might do a supported legs up the wall. So pop a blocker bolster under the hips and then let the legs float up. It's a really nice, relaxing kind of resting shape before Savasana. So that might be sort of a little bit of a cool down sequence after the back bend already being on the back. So you can see how where you are in space makes a difference as to how you're going to be cooling your students down. So one big thing that I like to do is I like to, after my peak pose, or after I've kind of got to the bulk of my sequences done, we'll just say it's peak pose for now because it's easiest. The way that I like to silently sort of let students know that we're heading into the cool down, because as a yoga student, sometimes your concept of time is a little bit off. You might not have any idea how a class is put together. You might not have any sense of what time it is, how long is left. So I usually, for the most part, depending on where we are, like to bring my students into child's pose for about 10 breaths. Doesn't always work that way, like I said, if you're on your back or in a different shape, but generally coming into a resting shape for about 10 breaths. I find that's just a nice way for students to kind of start getting into the cool down portion of the class. Time-wise, at this point, you're likely at about 35 to 45 minutes of your class already, if it was a 60-minute class. That gives you around 10 minutes of cool down time in order to have roughly a 10-minute-ish Savasana. I know that out there in the real world, it can be really difficult to teach a 10-minute Savasana in a public class setting. And I know that that's tough, but it is possible, whether it's exactly 10 minutes or maybe it's 6 to 7 minutes with, the getting up out of it and closing the class, those things. But try and aim for as long as you reasonably can for your Savasana once you're out there teaching in a public class setting. So yeah, we're kind of about the 35-40 minute mark. So some cool down poses, any of your seated poses pretty much, seated forward fold, butterfly, seated twist, Janu Shirsasana. I'm back. So seated poses, great. Hip opening poses, pigeons, kind of a nice cool down pose for me, and maybe not for everybody because they might be quite intense, but hip stretches are really nice. Any of your supine poses, thread the needle, happy baby, legs up the wall. I'm trying to think of other things. Leg stretches with a strap on your back, also amazing. They all make great cool down poses. And one thing you can think about is cool down poses that fit with your theme. So if my theme was second chakra, so we're talking hips, I will continue to choose hip related cool down poses. Pigeon pose, thread the needle, supine, leg stretches with a strap. If my theme was heart chakra, so back again. If it goes again, I'm definitely going to try and use my data instead of Wi-Fi. So if I'm doing heart chakra, I'm going to choose cool down poses that have something to do with this upper area of the body. So shoulder stretches, twists, maybe a restorative back bend with a bolster. That's also really lovely. You can be creative here with your cool down. And again, if we're thinking about theming, threading the theme throughout is a very clever way to do this. So it's not just selecting random cool down poses, but what cool down poses. Okay, keeps going in and out. Now I'm on data. We'll see what happens. So be creative. Think of your theme. Choose cool down poses that work with your theme, that work with the orientation of where the body is coming from. Music. And the next point is music can be a really important part of your cool down. This is the part of the class where the pace is going to start shifting. So having your music reflect that is extremely important. So you want to create playlists that roughly fit with the time of the class. So your playlists are, say, for 60-minute classes, or if you tend to teach 75-minute classes, 75-minute classes, you want to try and arrange those songs so that the cool down type vibe of music starts to be introduced around the 35-40 minute mark. The reason to do this ahead of time is A, so you don't have to think about it. B, so that you're not trying to have your students rest in child's pose and there's like really intense upbeat music happening, because that can be a little discombobulating for some people. And also, you don't want to be a DJ while you're teaching a class. So if you've done it ahead of time, prepared your playlist, you're good to go. This also gives you an opportunity to be reminded through the music, if you know your playlist well, that this is cool down. You might have maybe extended out that bulk of the sequence a little more, and maybe you're not aware of the time, but then you'll start to hear that kind of more mellow music coming in, and it will be a light bulb that says, okay, we need to start winding this down. So it can be a timing assist for you as the teacher if you've taken the time to carefully curate your playlists. This is how I do it. I've created some playlists, and I tend to reuse the same playlists because I like them, but they fit perfectly with how I would like to time most of my classes. So I find it's just really helpful for me. If you're teaching a vinyasa style class, this cool down would be the section where things will start to shift a little bit. You will have focused for the last 35-40-ish minutes on moving and flowing with the inhale and the exhale breaths. Now in the cool down, we start to let that go. And we start to just hold poses for a little bit longer. We're still cueing, a breath in, a breath out, or wherever you're choosing to do it, but we're not doing poses for one breath. Everything's slowed down. And now the final point about the cool down, the same with your voice. So like your music, use your voice, the tone of your voice, the quality, the colors in your voice to reflect the changing vibe of the class. These are all ways that you can help your students to begin to think about relaxing a little bit, softening a little bit, slowing a little bit. And if you're using that same upbeat voice that you were just using for them holding Half Moon, that's maybe not going to come across the same way. So think about using your voice like you do all the other tools that you have for teaching. That took 15 minutes just to talk about the cool down. So just to recap the cool down part, select poses that make sense for where the body is in space, for the theme of your class, the intention of your class. Begin at about the 35-40 minute mark in the class. That gives you a good 10 minutes for cool down. It has to be flexible. Sometimes you'll run over, sometimes you'll extend the cool down because things happened way faster than you thought they would, and it's only 30-ish minutes and already it's getting close to the end. So there is a certain degree of flexibility needed. Pick poses that Oh, I said that makes sense with your class. The music, think about the music. In a vinyasa class, think about kind of moving out from that steady flow with breath and movement, and then use your voice in a way that helps to reflect what's happening at this part in the class. So now we get to Savasana. So we've cooled down enough that we're likely down on the back. And for me, I prefer to have the last couple of cool down poses on the back, because I think that it is just having students already be down there just is sort of this lovely way to slip into Savasana. It's fine, maybe all your cool down poses are seated and then you cue students down onto the back for Savasana. Nothing wrong with that at all. I just like to have kind of a couple of standards. I usually like to do some sort of supine twist for sure before Savasana, and probably a happy baby, and then we're in it. And that's just sort of standard in most of my classes. So I like to let my students know we're moving into Savasana. So I say something like, let's begin to slowly set ourselves up for Savasana, the final resting pose. Now I add the final resting pose as you could have people in your class who don't know what Savasana is, so it's nice to let them know that it is a resting shape. And then I offer some guidance for ways Savasana can be set up. So I've been to classes where there's very little guidance given, and there's a lot of merit in that, into letting people just sort of come into final resting shape, lying down on your mat, and then we're in Savasana. But I think we can enhance our classes by offering guidance and offering suggestions for ways we can really relax. So if you're offering props for Savasana, I highly suggest that before you've come down onto the back, so before you've rolled down onto your back in whatever part of your cool down, that you have students move those props to kind of the midpoint of the mat. Because nobody wants to get up. You're laying down in Savasana, and the teacher says, and you might, if you have any discomfort in your low back, you might like to put a bolster under your knees or your thighs, and you think, oh yeah, I do have discomfort in my low back, but my bolster's all the way at the top of my mat, so now I either choose not to use it, or I have to get myself up, get the bolster, come back down. So it's a little thing, and it's maybe it seems like a minor detail, but these are the very subtle things that we can thread through a class, and suggestions we can give, and our organization as a yoga teacher that can make the experience just overall kind of smooth and seamless. And nobody might know that you did that. Nobody probably went away and thought, wow, that teacher was really clever to say, move the bolster after the seated butterfly before we roll down onto the back. But they're sort of subtle ways that we can guide our students with compassion and kindness and forethought, so that there is less kind of disruption involved in a class. So big suggestion is plan where props need to be way ahead of time, so nobody needs to kind of get up, and also don't offer props if nobody has that prop. If you didn't suggest at the start of class to take a bolster and nobody has a bolster, well, no. I've been in classes where people have gotten up and walked and got a bolster and come back, and if it's just not available, then you maybe just don't mention it. But say some things that can help your students find different ways to relax. You might guide them through a quick kind of body scan relaxation. That's always really nice once you're down on the back. And then once everybody's settled, everybody's there, I like to guide breath for a few moments, something like samavriti, or what's known as equal breathing, where you count to 4 on the inhale and 4 on the exhale. This is just a nice way to kind of have everybody find their breath again. And then after a few moments, maybe 5-6 cycles, I cue everyone to just let go of that and allow their bodies to breathe naturally on their own. If you didn't want to do the breathing, this might be where you wrap your theme back in. You might mention something about your theme. So if your theme was second chakra. Maybe you bring some awareness to the hips. You maybe have students just rock their pelvis gently from side to side and then feel the weight of the hips settle down into the mat, that sense of relaxation radiating out from the pelvis. And let the weight of your pelvis and the weight of your body melt into the mat and allow you to soften into the earth for the next few moments. Something like that. It's just a nice way to kind of tie that theme back into Savasana. And so now we've put them in Savasana. Everybody's set up. We've guided them for a few moments. And this is a nice way to demonstrate that we're here holding the space. You're not on your own, lying down in silence. No problem. And then we leave them in silence. And that's the big part of Savasana. And it's sometimes, for some of us, the most difficult part, because being comfortable with silence takes time and practice, and being comfortable with silence is challenging. It can be challenging because you might notice your students fidgeting or kind of looking uncomfortable, or you yourself might feel like, I need to be doing something here. I just sit, I close my eyes, I open my eyes every once in a while just to scan the room, check in, make sure everything's okay, but I'm essentially kind of holding space in a meditative type position. I'm not moving around the room. I'm not saying anything. And I find that this took time to develop, being comfortable with this for sure. And it's important to think about, because it's happened to me a few times, and I've seen it myself when I've been the student, where maybe a teacher is kind of like looking at their phone, or they're kind of looking around the room, or sometimes they're doing stretches and things like this, and at any moment a student might open their eyes in Savasana and kind of turn their head to the front just to make sure that you're still there, everything's okay. And if they see you on your phone, if they see you kind of looking disinterested, that vibe is felt. So it's not a long amount, it's not a huge amount of time, but it's time that you're sitting there in a meditative like position. Maybe it feels very meditative, and you're holding space, you're there. If anything happens, anybody needs anything, anything goes awry, you're there. You are holding that space for your students. Some tips that I've learned along the way for Savasana, because some things are outside of our control. If you're teaching in a studio or gym, there might be a lot of noise. Maybe there's tons of noise outside, loud music playing, cars, people talking, these kind of things. If you start to see that collectively the room starts to get a little bit fidgety, then what I would do in that situation is I come back to guiding the breath. So yes, I'm cutting short that silent period of Savasana, but I'm sort of deciding what's the better of two options. Is it better to leave my students in silence when everybody's visibly uncomfortable, disturbed, unhappy, kind of moving? Or do I come back to guiding the breath so that my voice can cover a little bit of that outside noise, that we can still be in this sort of meditative-ish, relaxed pranayama type practice, but we don't have to be in total silence, aware of every single beat of music that's kind of drifting into the room. So you have to be creative and flexible, and yes, it's great to have 10 minutes of Savasana, but of silence for Savasana, but sometimes life doesn't permit that to be the most relaxing thing ever. So we need to kind of be adaptive. And in that supine position, lying on your back, just a great way to remain relaxed but aware is to come back to kind of focusing and following the breath. So that's just something that I found over the years is a nice way that stops me being kind of like stressed out and anxious. If there's, like crazy music floating into the room, because you can try and turn your music up, but then it just becomes like a battle of the bands, and it's just different, and kind of a nicer way to end class is to not feel like you're fighting for sound. So say it all went well, it was lovely and silent. Now, how do we let students know that Savasana is ending? I personally like to say something along the lines of and my voice is projecting, but it's still got that kind of Savasana softness to it. So gently notice the rise and fall of your breath, and then I just wait. So I let students know to notice their breath again. And then I'll probably say something along the lines of, if it makes sense for you, begin to slowly explore some lovely movements in your body. Wait, give them some space, some time to do that. And then I usually say, if you'd like to remain on your back, you're welcome to do so. If you'd like to stay on your back to close the practice, you can. If you'd prefer to come to join me in a seated position, then you might roll to one side and slowly press yourself up to a comfortable seated position. Something along those lines. Not everybody wants to come up to sit at the end of the class, and for some people, I've just found that it's hard for them, so offering that they can stay on their back is no big deal, and just a nice way to keep the class inclusive as well. We need to remember, if you're doing anything mudra-y or anything like this, that there will be people on the back, so you might want to address that as well. And then the closing of the class. So now we're here at the closing. I've got 4 minutes. So the closing is usually where you might briefly bring your theme back. So once everybody's back to seated, or they're still on their back, but everybody's in the position that they want to close the class, you might have them close their eyes, maybe hands on the thighs or hands to the chest, and maybe you say something just to kind of wrap up the whole thing. So if it was second chakra, you might say something briefly like, before we close class, just take note of the sensations in the area of your pelvis, this area that we've kind of gently awoken today through our hip opening shapes, through the different practices we've explored. And then I usually say something along the lines of, and just take a moment to thank yourself for finding time in your day to practice self-care, for looking after your body, looking after your mind. And I usually end all of my classes with that little, take a moment to thank yourself for finding time today. All my classes kind of end with something exactly like that or similar. And then at the end, I say thank you to everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I'll see you next time. And then something that I do is I help my students put the props away. Because this usually is an opportunity, as we're doing this, to have some really relaxed conversation and just to get to know them a little bit more. And it feels like this, a sense of community. So sometimes if I'm having a really great day, I'll say, leave your props exactly as they are. I'm going to take care of them for you today. Please just head out when you're ready, and I'll see you all next time. And then I'll put the props away, or I don't say anything and we put the props away together and I help them. And if there's someone new who's new to yoga, new to my class, usually I'll go to them and help them put the props away, so I have an opportunity just to have a moment with them in case they do have a question but don't feel like coming up to the front, or if not, then I've just helped them put their props away. And usually I try and wait till everybody's left the space, and then I will leave. I'll turn my music off, and then I'll go. I like to try and be like, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes you have the people who just want to sort of stay longer, or maybe they're taking the next class and they're just going to hang out on their mat before it starts. So, but I don't want to be first out of the room. I think that it's important for me, at least, to be one of the last. So I feel like it's a complete circle of me opening the space and then closing the space. So that is part 3 of class planning. That last part was a little bit rushed, but basically it's about how you're going to close your class, and it's always nice to bring a mention of your theme back into it. It doesn't have to be a whole 5-minute closing explanation of the theme, but just a very short awareness that yes, we had a theme, this was our theme, and then closing the practice. Because otherwise we introduce a theme at the beginning, maybe there's not a way to bring it in throughout, and then it's sort of like, oh, what was the theme for that class? What was it? If you're able, bringing a little bit of a mention of your theme and then sharing a way that might be thread throughout your student's day is really nice as well. So if your theme was, I'm just going to go over now because I want to say this part, but if your theme was mindfulness, maybe as you close your class you could say something along the lines of, and as we've practiced throughout our class together today, this idea of mindfulness, being aware of things as they're happening, being aware of breath, being aware of movement, know that you can take this with you throughout your day. Any moments you start to feel overwhelm or anxiety, find your breath, find sensations in your body, and come back home. Really simple, but an empowering way to show students that the practice is also applicable off the mat. And the more we can do that, the more we're teaching them that yoga is not just for the little piece of yoga mat that we have when we're practicing there. So I could talk forever about all of this, but I'll wrap it up. And thank you everyone for joining me again. As always, if you have questions or comments, pop them in the comments box here. And if you haven't seen the first 2 parts of this video, then in the Vimeo playlist that has all the weekly lives, you'll find them there. They happened, both of them, within the last month, I think, or last 5 weeks. So you'll be able to find them in there. And I hope that you all have a wonderful, wonderful day. Take care. Bye.